Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your presence at what I think will be an extremely stimulating conference. We're very proud at the Danube Institute to have brought along speakers of such distinction and expertise. I will be very brief and simply explain briefly that we will have an introduction to the topic and the conference as a whole by Geza Jarzynski, who is of course known to you as both a distinguished historian and as the first foreign minister of Free Hungary after 1989. He's also somebody who helped to found the movement that brought about the change, civic movement, and was of course a member of the first cabinet of Joseph Antal. He brings, therefore, both political experience and historical knowledge and to this topic. I will, after Geza has spoken, he has to leave early, so he will retire to the front row, and we will invite Andrew Roberts to give the keynote address. After that, we will break for a coffee break, and then we will resume with three additional speakers, and with Andrew remaining on the platform. And after the three additional speakers, all of whom are distinguished in their own right and not merely additional, after they have spoken, we will then have a conversation with all of you with questions and answers. So having briefly outlined what's happening, let me invite Geza Jarzynski to give us the essentials of the Nazi-Soviet Pact.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you for the invitation and to be able to address such a good crowd and to speak in the company of such distinguished speakers. Well, the subject will be explained, discussed in more details. So I would like to say a few words in my original capacity of a historian, but a historian who tried to learn from history, or actually to try to teach his students that history is a genre, is a science, if you like, which should be borne in mind by politicians as well. Well, historians who called themselves Marxist used to proclaim that history ran along a predetermined course. That is obviously sheer nonsense, as we know, just looking back at the 20th century or any other period. We know history is unpredictable and inscrutable, and the very fact that after the communist takeover, Hungary became a free country in 1989, 1990, shows exactly that the Marxist version of history was extremely erroneous. Explanation and interpretation must go with the presentation and assessment of the facts and events, but that is not enough. E.H. Carr, a British journalist turned historian, is in his What is History, emphasized that the historian's task is to, quote, explain why one course was eventually chosen rather than another, end of quote. Trevor Roper, I think a more distinguished historian, pointed out that examining possible alternative outcomes of history is not a parlor game, but is an essential part of the historian's work. Now I quote him, "At any given moment in history, there are real alternatives. It is only if we place ourselves before the alternatives of the past, only if we live for a moment in its still fluid context, that we get historical knowledge." If one is old-fashioned to believe in the maxim historia est magistra vitae, which I took to heart from my first lesson in Latin in the secondary school, and which I still consider valid, it is only extremely regrettable that people, and particularly politicians, usually dismiss the obvious lessons history provides. History is a philosophy, teaching by examples, thought the first by Viscount Bolingbroke, and the antecedents of the Second World War offer many object lessons for that. I fully agree with Trevor Roper's critique of the popular historian H.J.P. Taylor, who in 1961 asserted that Hitler did not plan for war. He only used the opportunities presented by his foreign colleagues and rivals. Trevor Roper argued that Hitler, in Mein Kampf in 1924 and elsewhere, had already outlined his program of conquest. He accused Taylor of perverting the evidence. To quote Trevor Roper, "I think Mr. Taylor's book is utterly erroneous. He selects, suppresses, and arranges evidence on no principle other than the needs of his thesis. And that thesis, that Hitler was a traditional statesman of limited aims, merely responding to a given situation, rests on no evidence." I think it is not difficult, not hard to agree with Trevor Roper. And today's talk, what does this discussion will, I think, prove it too. Whether Taylor was deliberately provocative or really meant all what he wrote is of secondary importance. No serious historian can doubt that Hitler was a rascal who wanted to create a vast Third Reich, controlling directly or indirectly at least the European continent. And he could not believe that that was possible to achieve without war. What we are concerned today is to what extent was he, Hitler, assisted unwittingly by miscalculating the other villain, Stalin, with the infamous Pact of August the 23rd. The pact allowed Hitler to launch the most terrible war in human history and enabled Stalin, after the war, to expand his Soviet Union into an empire and to become a superpower capable of obliterating all his adversaries, the whole free world, of course, at the price of annihilating his own country as well. Without the pact, this would not have happened. The Molotov-Ribbentrop, or more correctly, Hitler-Stalin Pact, resulted from follies, blunders committed by well-meaning European leaders who, remembering the destructions of the First World War, wanted to avoid another war by all means. That was a commendable aim, but disregarded that they were facing not one, but two unscrupulous dictators, two inhuman monsters. The democratic leaders wanted to be fair, admitted that Germany was unfairly treated after the Great War, and believed that by meeting Hitler's legitimate-sounding demands, belatedly applying the principle that guided the peacemaking of 1919-1920, Hitler could be pacified. The Versailles Treaty, we celebrated or mourned the 100th anniversary just recently, described by John Maynard Keynes as the Carthaginian peace. The humiliation of Germany in many ways certainly helped Hitler's rise. It is seldom mentioned, however, that following Hitler becoming the Chancellor of the Reich, Poland immediately proposed to France, its ally, a preventive war to replace the war threat represented by Nazism. By hindsight, it was a wise idea. Sadly, it was discarded without much thinking. It was certainly a missed opportunity. It has become a commonplace that reintroducing conscription in Germany in 1935, followed by the remilitarization of the Rhineland, should have been a warning. We now know that Hitler was ready to withdraw from the demilitarized zone if his troops had met any armed action by the French. It is even more obvious that the Anschluss, the rape of Austria, the most serious formal infraction of the peace treaty, should not have been swallowed. True, one may say that if President Wilson's principle of self-determination had been the basis of the post-First World War settlement, 3 million Germans would not have become unhappy, unwilling citizens of Czechoslovakia, making that new creation so vulnerable. But once the Sudetenland was assigned to Czechoslovakia at Munich and had become militarily such a, before Munich, sorry, in first post-First War settlement, and the Sudetenland had become militarily such a formidable line of defense, Czechoslovakia should not have been pressured to surrender it to Germany in the Munich conference on the 29th of September. That meeting was rightly denounced by Winston Churchill, who then was just considered a somewhat irresponsible warmonger. Quote him, "You saved peace. You betrayed little Czechoslovakia. England could choose between dishonor and war. Chose dishonor and still will have war," he shouted on October the 5th in the Parliament to Chamberlain, the Prime Minister. Munich was not only betrayal, it was a folly. It offers 3 important alternatives to consider. First, if the Paris Peace Conference had followed the Wilsonian principle of self-determination, as I mentioned, the newly created Czechoslovak state would not have been given the Germans, 3 million, and 1 million Hungarians. That award proved a burden in 1938 and enabled Hitler to appear justified in his territorial demands. Second, if Germany had not been given the coveted German inhabited territory without a war, the conspiracy by the Prussian officers, who were determined not to allow a not sufficiently prepared Germany to start a war, and they had a well-prepared plan to arrest and depose Hitler, then most probably they would have been successful, resulting in the removal of Hitler. Learning about the surrender at Munich, they dropped the plan. Third, Czechoslovakia in 1938 had a 40 division strong army, exactly as strong in number and in equipment as the Wehrmacht was then. And there were very strong fortifications on that mountainous border. It would have been extremely difficult to overcome them, unlike the Polish Plain a year later, which allowed the armored divisions of Germany to penetrate the very heart of Poland relatively easily. So the alternative in 1938 was that Czechoslovakia does not accept Munich and is rather ready to fight. If Czechoslovakia resisted, it would have been more difficult, or very difficult for France and Britain to stand aside and not to attack Germany from the west, forcing on Hitler a war on 2 fronts which he, and even more his generals, abhorred. By the end of 1938, Hitler would have been finished if the Czechs had opted for fighting for their country. As all those excellent opportunities to stop Hitler were squandered, there really was no other alternative to prevent a new world war than aligning with the rightly detested Bolshevik state. It was not yet known that the Great Terror decimated both its political and military leadership, making Stalin's country very weak. It is easy to understand the reluctance of Britain to ally with the Soviet Union, but by doing so, Stalin would not have been able to demand and receive the price Hitler was ready to pay him a few days later, and which eventually the Western powers also paid. The astute German dictator offered a deal to Stalin of partitioning Poland and dividing northeastern Europe between themselves. Stalin understandably accepted the deal and by that enabled Hitler to attack Poland. If Stalin had not been an unprincipled dictator and had refused the German offer, Hitler would not have launched his attack on Poland on September the 1st. With or without an anti-Hitler alliance with the Western democracies, the Soviet Union would not have been attacked in 1941, eventually losing 25 million people. Or if later Germany had still attacked Poland, France and Britain would have been far better prepared for war and could have honored their obligations to help Poland immediately. And again, the outcome would have been very different. The Soviet Union would have been unlikely to attack Poland in that case, and later wouldn't have been able to occupy and annex the Baltic states. So my conclusion is that the pact signed by Molotov and Ribbentrop was very far from being inevitable, and neither was the Second World War. It is tempting to try to draw lessons from the story of the 1930s for the present. But of course, historical political parallels are dangerous and can often mislead. But appeasing small dictators or big dictators make them grow strong and more formidable. And even a superpower might be restrained if those threatened by it stick together. So in NATO, we still have a guarantee for peace in Europe, unless the alliance falls apart. Similarly, if South Korea, Japan, and probably Vietnam and the Philippines were ready to set aside their historical and newer differences, they would present a common front and the threat of war in the Far East would diminish. So, history, observing its obvious and irrefutable lessons, should be known and taken to heart by the present political leaders as well. But historically conscious public apparently just cries in the wilderness as we do. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Geza, thank you very much indeed. And as we know, you will have to leave before the session ends, but so yeah, you've told us that, and it's unavoidable. Now, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, in many respects, is the apex of the age of totalitarianism, which was most of the 20th century. It's an extraordinarily important, significant, and interesting event. It came as a shock, although in retrospect it should not have done, but it did. It also has attracted an enormous amount of comment in the past, in literature, in political science. It occurs in Hollywood movies and so on, and yet the anniversary this year has attracted far less comment than one might have expected. In fact, the principal commentator seems to have been the Russian Foreign Office, which has been attempting to dismiss it or to distort its significance. So it's an important event which covers an enormous amount of geographical territory because it leads to a world war, and philosophical territory because it seems to unite the extremes in left and right, and of political territory because it involves the dramatic change in world power and its distribution from 1939, August, to 1945 and later. The mutual friend of Andrew Roberts and myself, Hugh Thomas, once remarked that there are two kinds of historians. Those with the theory of history and those with the knowledge of history. I think we can say, when we look at the extraordinarily impressive list of publications that is in the program describing Andrew's historical writings, we can say that he possesses, in an extraordinary measure, a knowledge of history. He begins writing classic biographies rather, of 19th century and early 20th century British statesmen like Lord Salisbury and Lord Halifax. He crosses the continent to write about the Napoleonic War and about the contrasting achievements of statesmen like Churchill and Hitler and others, and culminating, I think, in his master's book, Masters and Commanders. One book in particular, I think, should interest you. He took on the difficult duty, which he accomplished marvelously, of writing the next volume of Churchill's History of English-Speaking Peoples, which of course, Churchill had not himself been able to write. And now, of course, among his other books, he has written what seems to me to be an almost impossible achievement. He has written a new and original biography of Winston Churchill, which breaks new ground and which draws on the archives and new information, which I would have thought there couldn't be anything new about Churchill. But this book is packed full of information, thanks, among other people, to Her Majesty the Queen, who made available her father's wartime diaries of discussions with Churchill. So there's a knowledge of history here which is quite remarkable amount on which he can draw to discuss the significance of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And he's an old friend of 35 years. He accomplished all these things in what seems to me to be the twinkling of an eye since we met in 1984. And it's a great pleasure to me to introduce him and to listen to what he has to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be invited to address you today, and thank you very much indeed, John, for those kind words, which make me feel very old, by the way. Samovars of black tea had been served, followed by caviar, vodka, and Crimean champagne, when in the Kremlin in the early hours of Wednesday the 23rd of August 1939, beneath a large framed photograph of Lenin, the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and the Russian Commissar for Foreign Affairs V.I. Molotov signed what became known to history as the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Stalin stood behind them, beaming his approval. The pact covered the economic sphere, with Germany providing military equipment to Russia in exchange for raw materials, such as oil, grain, iron, and phosphates. It was also a non-aggression pact, committing themselves not to aid each other's enemies or to engage in hostile acts against one another. But crucially, it also had the notorious secret protocols, under which the two states agreed to partition Poland between them, with Germany taking the larger part, while Hitler conceded that the independent Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, Finland and parts of Romania would fall into the Soviet sphere, and later, of course, further south, the Soviets also seized Bessarabia and northern Bukovina from the Romanians, giving Stalin the chance to expand the Soviet Union to include parts of the old Russian Empire of pre-revolutionary times. It's sometimes forgotten, and there have only been two books on the pact in English over the last 40 years, in over 40 years. So it's often forgotten that Stalin also handed back a substantial number of German communists who had taken refuge in the Soviet Union after the Nazi seizure of power. Some of them, arrested during the purges, were taken directly from the Soviet Gulag to German concentration camps, where most of them were annihilated soon afterwards. For many years now, Stalin said of the pact, with his characteristically scatological imagery, we have been pouring buckets of shit on each other's heads, and our propaganda boys could not do enough in that direction. And now, all of a sudden, we are to make our peoples believe that all is forgiven and forgotten. Things don't work that fast. An illustration of this was that Ribbentrop had been feted in Moscow beneath swastika banners that had been hastily gathered from film studios that were busy making anti-Nazi films. Meanwhile, a German anti-Bolshevik entry to the Venice Film Festival was swapped for a Pushkin adaptation at the last minute. Although, of course, there was no public criticism of the pact in Russia, the front garden of Nazi Party headquarters in Munich was quickly filled with party badges and insignia thrown there by party members appalled at the thought of an alliance with a communist enemy that they'd spent their lives fighting against. It wasn't easy for either the German or Russian propaganda machines to make attractive personalities out of Ribbentrop, who was a former champagne salesman, or Molotov, whose nickname Stone Arse derived from the way that he never shifted in his seat even after hours of negotiations in which he would simply repeat the word niet. Ribbentrop, by the way, managed to fail at being a champagne socialist, even in New York in the Roaring Twenties, which must have taken some doing. The news that the world's leading fascist power had signed what looked to all intents and purposes like an alliance with the world's leading communist power, after years of mutual hatred and ideological opposition, left the world staggered. It was, and indeed remains to this day, the most cynical and the greatest volte-face in the history of great power diplomacy. As some wit in the British Foreign Office put it, all the isms have become wasms. It also exposed the pathetic failure of Neville Chamberlain's Tory-dominated national government to create a cordon sanitaire around Nazi Germany, as Winston Churchill had been calling for years, and represented a catastrophic defeat for both British and French foreign policy in not preventing the alignment of the two most powerful totalitarian powers. The New Zealand cartoonist David Lowe, then working for the London Evening Standard, caught the implications of the pact perfectly. Hitler and Stalin are shown bowing to each other as they raise their hats in greeting above the single word rendezvous. The bloody assassin of the workers, I assume, says a grinning Stalin. The scum of the earth, I believe, replies an equally jovial Führer. It's only after you read their words that your eye is drawn down to the prostrate corpse lying among the rubble between the two dictators. To some in the West, the pact actually simplified matters, making the coming war clearly one between democracy and totalitarian dictatorship in both its National Socialist and nationalist communist manifestations. The enemy at last was in plain view, says Guy Crouchback, hero of Evelyn Waugh's Sword of Honour trilogy. Huge and hateful, all disguise cast off. George Orwell satirised the situation in his novel 1984, where a sudden switch of alliances forces the hero, Winston Smith, to work overtime as he retrospectively rewrites newspapers to make it look as if the new alliance had always been in existence. In real life, the British historian Eric Hobsbawm was relaxed by what he merely described as the line change of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which he accepted with no reservations. Although Harry Pollitt, the British communist leader, parroted the communist line, as one would expect, there were some resignations from the party, though comparatively few considering what had taken place, as I'm sure David will be telling us later. Sellers of the party newspaper, the Daily Worker, were spat on and assaulted in the streets. Doors were slammed in their faces and chamber pots emptied over their heads from upstairs windows. Once the USSR attacked Finland in late November 1939, there were some more resignations from the party, though not Hobsbawm, who also stayed a party member after Hungary was invaded in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Having not resiled from a single one of his views all his life, and indeed having stated on the record in the 1990s that he thought Stalin's purges, gulag, and massacres had been justifiable, he was made a companion of honour by Tony Blair. The immediate result of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, of course, was the blitzkrieg attack of Germany against Western Poland 9 days later, followed by a fortnight, and after that by the Russian invasion of eastern Poland, resulting in yet another partition of that country, to follow those of 1772, 1793, and 1795. But, as Marek will doubtless be telling us, this one was to be far more vicious than the previous three, leading to the deaths of 17% of the Polish population between 1939 and 1945, more than any other country in the Second World War, except possibly the Philippines under Japanese occupation. With only 3 Polish divisions covering the 800-mile-long eastern border, it came as a complete surprise when at dawn on the 17th of September, the USSR invaded. The Russians wanted revenge for their defeat at Poland's hands in 1920, access, of course, to the Baltic states, and a buffer zone against Germany. And they opportunistically grabbed all 3 without any significant resistance. Their total losses amounted to only 734 killed. Stalin used his what he called Polish colonialism in the Ukraine and Belarus as his gossamer-thin casus belli. arguing that the Red Army had invaded Poland in order to restore peace and order. Sorry, after your quotation of Latin, I should make that casus bellum, of course, Gaza. Then, in one of the most despicable acts of naked viciousness of the war, in the spring of 1940, the Red Army transported 4,100 Polish officers who had surrendered to them under the terms of the Geneva Convention to a forest near Smolensk called Katyn, where they were each shot in the back of the head. The chief NKVD executioner, Vasily Blokhin, led the squad responsible, wearing leather overalls and an apron and long leather gloves to protect his uniform from the blood, and using a German Volta pistol because it didn't jam when it got hot from repeated use. Nevertheless, he complained he got blisters on his trigger finger by the end of the third day of continuous executions. In all, 21,857 Polish soldiers were executed by the Soviets at Katyn and elsewhere in that operation, which after the Germans invaded Russia, Stalin's police chief, Lavrenti Beria, admitted had been a mistake. When the Germans uncovered the mass graves on the 17th of April 1943, Goebbels broadcast the Katyn massacre to the world, but Soviet propaganda made it out that it had been undertaken by the Nazis themselves, a lie that was knowingly colluded in by the British Foreign Office until as late as 1972, even though charges against the Germans over Katyn were tacitly dropped from the Nuremberg trials. Because the Germans had already moved into several areas behind Warsaw by mid-September 1939 and indeed had taken Brest-Litovsk and Lvov, some fighting broke out between Russians and Germans, with 2 Cossacks killed in one incident and 15 Germans in another. Ribbentrop flew again to Moscow in order to agree the lines of demarcation, and after an evening at the Bolshoi watching Swan Lake and negotiating with his Russian counterpart, Molotov, VI Molotov, lasting until 5 o'clock in the morning, it was agreed that the Germans would get Warsaw and Lublin, and the Russians the rest of eastern Poland, as well as their free hand in the Baltic. The Germans withdrew from towns such as Brest-Litovsk and Bialystok in the new Russian sector, and the fourth partition in Poland's history was complete. Molotov would have done well, however, to have taken note of Hitler's statement made many years before in Mein Kampf, quote, "Let no one argue that in concluding an alliance with Russia we need not immediately think of war, or, if we did, that we could thoroughly prepare for it. An alliance whose aim does not embrace a plan for war is senseless and worthless. Alliances are concluded only for struggle." Unquote. When Molotov visited Berlin in November 1940 to negotiate further with Ribbentrop, the RAF bombed the German capital. Churchill made a good joke about it. He said, "Though not invited to join the discussions, we did not wish to be entirely left out of the proceedings." Down in the Reich Chancellery bunker, Ribbentrop informed Molotov that the war against Britain had essentially been won. "Then what are we doing in this shelter?" Molotov understandably asked him. "And whose are those bombs?" That was the occasion, of course, that Adolf Hitler told Molotov that the first time that the United States would be able to militarily intervene in the Western theatre was going to be in the year 1970. So why did Stalin make a pact with Hitler, a man who in his whole career had taken no notice of any treaties at all? Stalin was a paranoiac who only ever trusted one person in his whole life, Adolf Hitler, the least trustworthy man on the planet. The answer is that he genuinely believed that there was little to choose between the capitalist countries, Germany, Italy, America, France, and Britain, despite the bacillus of fascism having infected the first 2, but not the last 3. Because, under Marxist-Leninist thought, capitalism inevitably leads to imperialism and thus fascism, Stalin was unable or unwilling intellectually to differentiate between the actions of Nazi Germany and the bourgeois West, leaving him wide open to be duped by this pact. Because his ideology declared wars between capitalist powers to be endemic and something to be encouraged, he assumed that it would allow the Soviet Union to become what he himself called the laughing third man in a fight, whilst the capitalist imperialist powers destroyed each other. It was a woeful way to run a foreign policy, and 22 months later left the USSR wide open to the largest invasion in the history of mankind, Operation Barbarossa. Russia was terribly unprepared for the onslaught. The fortifications in the west of the country were still in the early stages of construction, and his army was stationed far too far west in Poland. On the very day that the German invasion swept eastwards, trains carrying oil and grain were going westwards from Russia to Germany in continuing fulfillment of the economic provisions of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Meanwhile, communist parties everywhere executed yet another ideological U-turn, and the wicked imperialist war became the heroic struggle against fascism. Stalin's refusal to accept that the Germans were going to attack, despite some 80 detailed warnings from Churchill and Stalin's own spy networks. His spy, Richard Sorger, actually gave him the correct date of the 22nd of June 1941, meant that 80% of the Soviet Air Force was wiped out in the western regions before it even had a chance to get off the ground. Its commander, Lieutenant General Ivan Kopets, that day committed suicide, which in Stalin's Russia was a sensible career move. The Russian armed forces weren't fully mobilized when Hitler attacked because Stalin didn't want to be seen to be provoking him, despite the build-up over the previous months of 3 million German troops on Russia's new borders. The genesis of this disastrous policy can thus be seen in Stalin's idiotically isolationist speech to the 10th Party Conference in March 1936, in which he urged the Communist Party to be cautious and not allow Soviet Russia to be drawn into conflicts by warmongers who were accustomed to have others pull the chestnuts out of the fire, i.e. the capitalist powers of the West. A year later, in 1937, he moved against the one organization that he most needed to defeat Germany, the Red Army, executing 3 of its 5 marshals, 15 of its 16 army commanders, 60 of the 67 corps commanders, and all 17 commissars. Marshal Chudensky was the model of the modernizing, thoughtful military reformer, but Stalin had him shot anyway in 1937, along with tens of thousands of colonels and other officers that he could ill afford to lose 4 years later. To make it all the more self-defeating, Stalin knew that these veteran Bolsheviks were loyal to the Communist Party, and the treason charges against them were baseless. Some future marshals were imprisoned, tortured, but not shot, such as Konstantin Rokossovsky, who had his fingernails pulled out and several ribs broken during interrogation. When Stalin reappointed him to high command after Operation Barbarossa, he asked him where he'd been, while knowing perfectly well what the answer was. Rokossovsky told his daughter that the reason he always carried a revolver with him was so that he could never be arrested again. Right across the Russian Empire, Stalin had created abattoirs for humans, supervising everything down to the best foliage to grow over the mass graves. If only Stalin knew what was going on was a frequent cry heard by Russians at every new atrocity. But Stalin knew precisely what was going on. It was he, or occasionally he and Molotov, who drew up the lists for torture and execution himself, often entirely at random because it was the numbers that mattered more than anything to do with genuine treachery or anti-Soviet activities. And what of the Baltic countries today, 80 years after the pact that condemned them to nearly half a century of oppression? George will tell us more later, but I think it's worth considering the words of the Lithuanian Foreign Minister, Linus Linkevicius, on the 18th of November 2016, when he said, "As a child, I still remember the sound of the tanks rolling through the streets of Vilnius. So even my generation, and I'm 34, still remembers when the Soviets were here as a invading army. They were Russian troops, they were invading us, and so the last thing we are on this subject is naive." It's important that we're not naive about Vladimir Putin's ill-disguised ambitions in the Baltics and elsewhere. With a quarter of the population of both Estonia and Latvia ethnically Russian, the opportunities for disruption and even irredentism are endless, should Mr. Putin wish to pursue them. His cyber attack on Estonia a few years back suggests he might. The real worry is that some figures in the Trump administration will simply not support the Baltic states if Russia destabilizes them. Estonia is in the suburbs of St. Petersburg, Newt Gingrich said on the record back in 2016. The Russians aren't going necessarily to come across the border militarily. The Russians are going to do what they did in Ukraine. I'm not sure I would risk a nuclear war over some place which is in the suburbs of St. Petersburg. I think we have to think about what does this stuff mean, he said. One can take issue with Mr. Gingrich's grasp of geography. Estonia is 85 miles away from St. Petersburg at its very closest point. But it's the history that matters most, for history is current affairs in the Baltic states. Historically, they are totally Western states. After Vytautas the Great became the Grand Duke of Lithuania in 1392, the country became one of the largest in Europe, and in cooperation with Poland defeated the Mongols. It confederated with Poland in 1569, which was a successful union for over 2 centuries, until smashed by the three late 18th century partitions that I mentioned earlier. Lithuania has a long history of resisting Russian oppression and supported Napoleon in his 1812 campaign. Only 20 years after winning its independence in 1920, the Baltic states were overwhelmed by Stalin as a result of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. On that occasion, the US Secretary of State Sumner Welles, back in 1940, made the brave and principled statement that the people of the United States are opposed to predatory activities no matter where they are carried on by the use of force or by the threat of force. The United States will continue to stand by these principles because of the conviction of the American people that unless the doctrine in which these principles are inherent once again governs the relations between nations, the rule of reason, of justice, and of law, in other words, the basis of modern civilization itself, cannot be preserved. It's a noble sentiment and a far cry, I think, from I think we have to think about what does this stuff mean. The Nazi-Soviet Pact exposed as never before or since the moral equivalence between Hitler's Third Reich and Stalin's Soviet Union that made them such natural bedfellows, the shared cynicism, duplicity, and brutally effective cruelty. There are still some who argue that whereas the Nazis were utterly evil, communists could be excused because the concept of equality is fundamentally attractive. It's a fundamentally attractive idea to many people. In A.N. Wilson, the novelist A.N. Wilson's 1996 novel, A Watch in the Night, there's a character called Hunter who, quote, is one of those people who believe that those who, during the 1930s, were hoodwinked by Stalin were all slightly lovable, in no way at fault for disbelieving the stories of genocides, concentration camps, and the show trials. Those who were guided by a comparable idealism into believing a different variety of nonsense were, by contrast, to be left forever in the dock beside the butchers of Nuremberg. Yet from the victim's viewpoint, being murdered for your social background was no better or worse than being murdered for your racial one. And anyhow, the desire for equality, is it really so benign? The defining feature of mankind is its extraordinary heterogeneity. Like snowflake and crystals, no two people are precisely alike, even in the case of identical twins, whose personalities diverge at birth, even if their physical features don't. There's software now that can identify individuals from millions of mugshots because of the multifarious, minute differences in everyone's faces. Not simply physically did nature make us all different. In outlook and personality, everyone is impossible to place, position, or pigeonhole. With no identikit, homogenized aspect of humanity, therefore, why should there be an equalized level of income? It flies in the face of heterodoxy, of nature, and of mankind. If we're not exactly the same in terms of anything else at all, why try to impose uniformity in wealth? Especially as history shows again and again that it can only be imposed with appalling misery and bloodshed wherever and whenever it's been tried. The desire for equality of outcome is the most beguiling of the siren voices, but in the 20th century it was also the most deadly, killing a total of 100 million people, according to the Black Book of Communism, twice the number who died in the Second World War. An article in the Times on its 80th anniversary said of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, by accommodating Germany's rise, the Western powers, however mistakenly, were trying to prevent war, The Soviet Union, by contrast, was trying to rebuild its empire on its western borders and did so in friendly cooperation with Hitler. The Kremlin lied about that for decades and obfuscates its behavior even now. We in Britain don't cover up our history, this article argued. We just forget about it. And there's a lot to be said for that. In a recent survey of schoolchildren, British schoolchildren, a large survey, 5,000 or so of them, and these were actual teenagers, they weren't young children. Some 20% of them said that they believed that Winston Churchill was a fictional character. 47% of them thought that Sherlock Holmes was a real person, and 53% thought that Eleanor Rigby was a real person. I would therefore like to congratulate John and the Danube Institute for helping to ensure that the story of these terrible times, which have such important lessons for us here, even 80 years later, are not forgotten. Thank you very much.
Andrew, I congratulate you on a marvellous, informative, fascinating talk, and secondly, on keeping to the timetable rigorously. So, thank you very much indeed. We will now break for a coffee. We will resume for our next three speakers, and then Andrew and the others and our other colleagues will be discussing each other's arguments and ideas and opening themselves to a debate with you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Welcome back for the second and final session, which I think is going to be extremely entertaining and as well as informative. And if it's equally as entertaining and as informative as the lecture we've just heard from Andrew, it will be a very powerful session. The first of our three speakers is David Gress. He's a distinguished Danish historian whose publications include the work From Plato to NATO, The Ideas of the West and Their Opponents. A book I remember reviewing myself in the magazine The National Interest years ago. It's a powerful and interesting book. He has also directed the European Congress on Freedom and the Future in the European College some years ago. And he continues to be a powerful analyst and commentator on affairs. I will, all the details about his life you can find there, but David, if I can ask you to talk respond to Andrew, but on whatever other aspects of the pact that interest you.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the invitation to address this impressive audience. And Robert is a very impressive actor follower. I won't even try. But John asked me to speak a little bit about the impact of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on the Western audience, by which I take him to mean, I mean mainly the European left and even the communist parties. Now, I'm going to diverge a little bit from what you've heard, but I'm going to try to remember what Geza said about Trevor Roper, saying that there were always alternatives. Going back into history, judging an historical event, we should try, I know it's impossible, but try to get out of our current skin and not pretend we know the outcome. So like the many members of the European communist parties and the European left, up to the pact, they didn't know the outcome. Now to start, what was the situation of the European left in the years before the pact? Well, I thought I knew the story pretty well. I found some things which I'm not sure I should believe completely, but I'm going to give them to you and you can help me judge whether they're worth believing. But first, general situation of the European left and the communist parties up until the mid-1930s was, as you may remember, the doctrine of total confrontation. Communists must have nothing to do with anybody else, especially not social democrats, because they were, as they were called, social fascists. The idea being, as I understand it, from Stalin on down, that if you did this as communists, if you rejected collaboration with the social fascists against the National Socialists and other fascists, well then, you would increase chaos, create chaos, and at one point these reactionary fascists would take power, as they did in Germany, and then chaos would ensue because they would be unable to govern, being not in the line of history, being against history. So, within a fairly short time after the revolution, after the right-wing revolution, power would collapse, and then you, the communists, could take over. Now that famously changed quite dramatically in 1935 with the 7th Congress of the Comintern, the Communist International, at which point the parole was given out to communist parties throughout the world. No. Social fascists are now allies against the real fascists, and we must stop fighting them. We must make popular fronts. A small twist to this is that the popular front idea didn't actually begin in 1935. It began at least a year earlier in France. Now, the French Communist Party in the interwar years was, after Hitler's takeover in Germany, without doubt the most important non-Soviet Communist Party. It was sort of Stalin's prize member. And here he, or someone, who else would it be, Stalin, tested the doctrine. In 1934, the communist leaders and socialist leaders met officially, without the communists yelling at the socialists, in May 1934, which can be said to be the birth of the First Popular Front. At this point, the French communist leader Maurice Thoré is still denouncing social fascists in L'Humanité, the paper, but he is told to stop doing that. And on July 29th of that year, the communists and socialists in France and Paris marched together on the 20th anniversary of the murder of Jean Jaurès, the socialist politician, just before World War I. Here comes the first little twist to this conventional story. The Comintern. The relationship of the Comintern to the Soviet Party and to Stalin is murky, to say the least. We do know that towards the end of the 30s, Stalin began pushing away the Comintern leaders. He put them in a hotel, the Hotel Lux in Moscow, where they were more or less left to their own devices. He was stopping using them as a tool. Now, so the Comintern was after 1935, being moved a little bit out on a sideline. The chief Comintern man was Georgy Dimitrov, the Bulgarian communist. Now here comes the first interesting thing. Georgy Dimitrov was charged in Germany for being responsible for the Reichstag fire in February 1933. The fire that, accidental as it probably was, enabled Hitler to push through his dictatorial measures, abolishing civil rights, abolishing secret mail, telephone, and so on. In any event, the Hitler government decided to charge Dimitrov with being behind the fire, Dimitrov and communists in general. This resulted in a famous trial in Germany, in Leipzig, at which Dimitrov was A, allowed to speak, B, allowed to speak on the radio. He could be heard all over Europe, my mother heard him. And so you wonder, what was going on here? Why did the Nazis allow Dimitrov to get up and yell and humiliate Hermann Göring in a courtroom? And nothing happened to him. He walked away unscathed. Now, there could be many reasons for this. But an American writer, Stephen Koch, has come up with the idea, based on various indicative things, that even in 1933, the Soviet GPU, later NKVD, and German secret services were talking. So why were they talking? Well, Stephen Koch believes that Stalin was kind of building up already then some kind of insurance policy, secret back channel connection to the Germans. The book in which this appears by Stephen Koch is not terribly well organized, and it's not clear where he has his information from in all cases. But in any event, his argument is that the Nazi-Soviet Pact goes back 6 years to the first secret talks between the secret police of the two supposedly hostile dictatorial powers. So, assuming this has something to it, what was Stalin doing? Was he just playing with people, playing with the Germans? One might think so. I think Stalin, he may have been paranoid, but I'm not sure he was very afraid of anything, and he was certainly never afraid of Hitler, I don't think. Several statements of Stalin from the time of the Pact indicate a lofty contempt for this little Austrian corporal. He didn't use the word Austrian corporal, but he was clearly felt himself to be vastly superior to Hitler. And he had good reason. The correlation of forces, to use a Marxist term, was very much in the Soviets' favor in the early to mid-30s. Don't forget, Germany had no right to a navy or an air force, and only a very, very small army up to 1935. The Polish army was several times as big, and the Poles indeed believed they would easily defeat the Germans in any war. General Joseph Beck had himself portrayed on horseback riding through the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. That would be the outcome, he thought, of any Polish-German war. The Poles would win hands down. They were very surprised in 1939 when it didn't happen. Back to the Popular Front era. 36, 37, 38. Stalin uses the common term to infiltrate intellectual organizations in the West, using as his cat's paw a man called Willy Münzenberg, another very shady character whose total history has never been written. But Münzenberg ran, at last count, some 40 or 50 front organizations in Western Europe and the United States, influencing politicians, intellectuals, writers, filmmakers, etc. Meanwhile, back in Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, Stalin summons the Polish Communist Party leadership to Moscow, where it is decimated, purged, partly because it's Polish, and Stalin could not forgive Poland for winning the war in 1920, where he was one of the Soviet commanders, didn't do very well, and also because many of his leaders were Jewish, which Stalin also did not like. Stalin, as Andrew also said, decapitates the German Communist Party. Stalin has 60 German communist leaders killed. Hitler had 80 killed. And then, of course, as Andrew said, Stalin, after the pact, hands back many of those surviving German communist leaders to the Nazis. Other parties are purged: Yugoslav, Finnish, Greek, Hungarian, Romanian, Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian parties are purged. The Bulgarian party is purged. The Italian party survives because its leadership under Palmiro Togliatti turns completely loyal to Stalin, and Togliatti goes on to great things after World War II. One of the other odd things in the later background to the pact is the Popular Front idea kind of got a life of its own. In Stalin's view, it was, I think, the idea to sort of infiltrate Western governments by making as if the communists wanted the same thing as progressive social democrats. But it went further than that. In Italy, for example, communists were told to make common front with the fascists. We're all workers together kind of thing. Well, now, the immediate background to the pact, from Stalin's point of view. Provoke war between Germany and Britain and France, destroy Poland. I think no one would disagree with that, really. Stalin himself was pretty clear on the subject. You make the imperialists fight each other, and then you are, as Andrew said, the laughing third man. And I think Stalin got away with that. He didn't much care that Russia lost 20 million people in World War II, because at the end of World War II, he was the laughing third man. He dominated, he bestrode Europe. So the game went entirely to his satisfaction and intent. Now, when the pact was signed, and this is what I was supposed to be talking about more, but I'll have to stop before too long, because most of this is known. The story about Dimitrov possibly being a cat's paw is not so much known. Dimitrov, however, is pulled out of semi-retirement and asked to explain the pact. And of course, he gives a standard line. The British and the French imperialists are the true aggressors. They want war. Germany had the choice of waging war on the Soviet Union on their behalf. The idea of Chamberlain and Daladier and so on getting Germany to join them in the anti-communist war. But, said Dimitrov, Hitler was smart, Germany was smart. They chose to join the USSR in saving the peace. Of course, but they didn't save the peace, they started the war, but this is Dimitrov. So now all of a sudden there's no more popular fronts. The communists in Western Europe must now, the pact being signed August 1939, must now do all they can to fight their own warmongering governments. And so you get this peculiar 18-month, 2-year period in which the communists really don't know many of them don't know what to do. You get conflicts in Italy, you get conflicts in France, and you get conflicts in many other parties. In a small point here, the German Communist Party is, of course, destroyed in part by Hitler. The survivors are in Moscow. One of the leaders, Walter Ulbricht, then says, well, the enemy is no longer Hitler, but London finance capital, which is attempting to fragment Germany in order to use Germany to wage war against the USSR. Hitler, in fact, even offered to release the communist leader, Ernst Thälmann, from prison in Germany. Stalin was not interested, and Thälmann later dies in camp. A note on the British here. Andrew mentioned Harry Pollitt. I have a Harry Pollitt quote here. Harry Pollitt, the British communist leader, knew the new line and tried to follow it, but he really didn't like it. I mean, he had some kind of honesty. He said at one point, "It would be easy to say that I accept the new line. Let us and the fascists kiss and make up, and all will be for the best. But I would be dishonest in relation to my convictions. I would be dishonest about what I would like to do. To smash those fascist bastards wasn't for all," end quote. The Italians adapted immediately. On August 20th, 1939, its daily in Paris proclaims the alliance of the USSR, France, and Britain as the only one able to save the peace. 3 days later, the same newspaper hails the German-Soviet non-aggression pact as, quote, an indubitable contribution to strengthening the peace, end quote. Now, Togliatti was in Paris at this point, happened to be, where he is arrested but not recognized by the police, and later exfiltrated to Moscow, where he resumes power in the party. I was going to end with a quote, but Andrew preempted me, and that is the quote from Evelyn Waugh, from the Sword of Honor trilogy, where you have very much a non-communist reaction, Waugh being Catholic and his hero being also Catholic, who sees, and I'm going to add to the quote, the modern age in arms as the alliance of the Germany and the Soviet Union. Again, I think from the point of view of Stalin, it was victory all down the line. From the point of view of the communists in Western Europe, it was a time of confusion. Let me remind you that, for example, during the German occupation of France in the first year, the communists were told to ask the German authorities by Stalin if they could reopen their party paper. And this was actually considered by the German ambassador in France until finally they decided, well, maybe that would be going a bit too far. So, generally speaking, reactions on the left in the communist parties, great confusion, and I think considerable relief when Germany attacked the Soviet Union and things began to look normal again, forgetting, of course, what had gone before. One final little quote. When the pact was signed, Arthur Koestler, perhaps the most famous anti-communist who ever lived, was in Moscow, and he wrote in one of his books that it was when I heard the Red Army band playing the Horst Wessel lead that I decided that this was it, that I had to leave the party. Now, I don't think he kind of heard the Horst Wessel lead. That was a party song. The Red Army band would most likely have been playing Deutschland über alles, but he was notoriously bad at remembering things. But in any event, thank you for your attention. The left was in a state of terminal confusion, and very few of them, including not Erich Hobsbawm, woke up to the fact of what was really going on here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Marek, if I could ask you to address us. Marek Matraszek is a leading business, economic and political consultant in Poland, having also, in a sense, Marek, you might be a child of the pact in the sense that you were born and brought up of Polish parents in England, largely a result of the conflict that the pact leads to. But would you like to speak from here or from there?
Well, thank you very much, John, for that introduction. I feel very daunted in following such august speakers as Andrew, of course, and everyone else on the panel. As you have revealed, John, I am not actually a historian, so I feel that I'm slightly here under false pretenses. But as you also rightly point out, my own background, having been born in England as a result of in some sense, I am the child of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as my father fled from Poland in the immediate aftermath of the conflict. So I have that, in a sense, that there's partially that responsibility also is there. I'll try and be as general as I can in the short time that I've been allotted, so forgive me if I don't go into as much detail as I would usually like to on this vitally important topic. And I will actually gloss over what one might think is the most important aspect of our discussion, which is the military consequences of the pact. Now, that's been already discussed in some detail. I do point out that actually yesterday, the 22nd of September, was the 80th anniversary of that common parade in Brest-Litovsk between the Nazi and Soviet forces. And we're very familiar with the history of the conflict of the Second World War and the destruction wrought not just on Poland and Poles, but also the Ukrainians, Belarusians, Jews, everyone who died in that catastrophic conflagration, which has left its mark on humanity for forever, I would have thought. So that military consequence, that civilizational consequence of the pact itself, I think is clear enough. But I really want to touch on the shadow that the pact has thrown on history afterwards. And I think the more as I made my notes for this meeting, I came to realize there's probably very few agreements or historical facts that have had such long-term consequences, which are not limited to the immediate period of the war itself, of that pact. So the initial consequence of the pact was obviously the military invasion of Poland by both Russia and the Soviet Union in September 1939. But there was a whole succession of human tragedies which ensued as a result of that, which was measured not just in terms of the military conflict, but I think the first expression as a matter of policy of ethnic cleansing. And this is something that the pact enabled, because alongside the military invasion of Poland by the Soviet Union on September 17th, 1939, almost immediately the Soviet forces, and under the direction of Stalin and Molotov, engaged in mass deportations of Poles from the occupied territories of eastern Poland. Between 200,000 and 300,000 Poles were forcefully evacuated in terrible conditions into the depths of the Soviet Union, into Siberia, beyond the Urals, into Kazakhstan. And this historical experience of the Poles weighs upon the Polish psyche to this day. And the mass deportation alongside, of course, which was another common point between the Nazi and the Soviet occupiers, the decimation, the destruction of the intellectual elites of Poland and of the eastern, of those Poles who were resident in the eastern parts, decapitated for generations a whole intellectual elite of Poland, which would have been Poland would have been well served after the war to have those people, but they were destroyed, they were killed. The deportations of 1939, which carried on right until 1941, resulted in, almost by accident, of course, the creation of the Anders Army. This was one of those peculiarities of history where a terrible action can lead to some good. The Anders Army, which was created immediately after the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany in 1941 as a result of the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and the Polish government in exile, allowed the Polish government in London to evacuate from the Soviet Union 80 to 90,000 soldiers who'd been captured by the Soviets in 1939 in the east part of Poland. And this army heroically, as many of you know, contributed greatly to the Allied victory, particularly in Italy and the Battle of Monte Cassino in 1944. But that is hardly something that can counterweigh the tragedy that befell those Poles who were unfortunately captured by the Soviets. Andrew has already spoken in some detail about the Katyn massacre in April 1940, which after it was uncovered by the German forces in April 1943, led to the rupture of diplomatic relations between Stalin and the Polish government in exile in 1941. And again, a further example of the tragedy of the pact, insofar as those officers who were killed, and it wasn't just military officers, it was many of the captured academics from Lvov and Vilnius universities who were murdered in barbaric circumstances in the forests of Katyn and in Soviet prisons in April 1940. But the third ethnic cleansing tragedy of the war, again as a result of the pact which took place, is one which is very little written about, and it was the Volleying Massacres, which were a tragic episode in the Second World War, which again reflected the evils of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland before the war, the Second Republic, was largely a place of ethnic peace, especially in eastern Poland. Despite rising tensions from the mid-1930s onwards, pre-war Poland had avoided some of the grosser ethnic tensions in other parts of Europe and allowed Poles, Jews, Ukrainians, and Belarusians to live peacefully side by side. The dynamics of the war, especially after 1943, encouraged Ukrainian nationalists to engage in a vicious campaign of slaughter of Polish villages, with the express intention of eliminating the last remnants of Polish civilization in that part of Europe, thinking ahead to a post-war Europe where the idea was to make the future, as it was then thought, possibly independent Ukraine, as ethnically pure as possible. And this ethnic cleansing is still relatively rarely written about, but it's cast a shadow on Polish-Ukrainian relations since, but I'll come back to that. But of course, the culmination of the story of the impact of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in the first wartime period concludes not with Katyn, not with the deportations, not with the Volleying Massacres, but in Tehran and Yalta, where the Western allies, Churchill among them, acknowledged that the eastern territories of Poland, the country in the defense of which England had actually gone to war on the 3rd of September, were to fall under the control of the Soviet Union. This was Stalin's demand. And again, it was a reflection of the fact that from Stalin's perspective, the border that was drawn as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, with small adjustments broadly along the line of the Curzon line, so-called, the 1920s, was a legitimate border between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. And this theory was accepted by the Western allies for a variety of reasons. And so the secession, as it were, of the eastern territories to Poland in 1939 by Hitler was cemented into international law as a result of the Tehran and agreements in the Yalta Conference in 1945. It's interesting that this secession of territories was never formally accepted by the Polish government in exile. And throughout the 1950s and 1960s, it remained a point of principle of the Polish government in exile in London that Poland had been a victim of an act of illegal wartime aggression by the Soviet Union. This annexation of territories was not to be acknowledged. I'll return to that in a minute. Now, of course, the result of this acceptance of the Molotov-Ribbentrop line in 1945 was accompanied by the final denouement, as it were, of ethnic movements, whereby the remaining Polish inhabitants of Lvov and Vilnius and other territories in the east of pre-war Poland were transferred to those territories that had been taken from Germany east rather of the Oder-Neisse line, and populated those territories where in turn Germans themselves were expelled into what was then into the Federal Republic of Germany largely, creating for the first time historically an ethnically pure Polish state. And it's an interesting thought experiment to think that had that ethnic state not been created, ethnically compact ethnic state after 1945, whether you would have had the same dynamics of history, again, the what-ifs of history. Would a Poland in the pre-war 1939 borders have been effectively been able to overthrow the shackles of communism had it been occupied by Russia and the Soviet Union? And the creation of that ethnically compact state, of course, was leveraged by the communists themselves, drawing on pre-war nationalist ideology and claiming themselves to be the inheritors of the Piast Poland tradition, a Poland from the Bug River in the east to the Oder in the west. And as a way of legitimizing their authority, the communists made much use of that new historical circumstance. So the brutalities of war, I think, was the first impact of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. But that, as it were, was superseded after 1945 with the continued shadow of the pact, which continued. And it really related to what I was speaking about a few minutes ago, about the consensus in Poland about the fate of the Eastern Territories. I already mentioned that for many in the Polish government in exile, for many Poles who had remained in London and in Western Europe after the war, the sentiment of Lwów, of Vilnius, of Brest, and other towns in the east of Poland remained a very, very strong emotional. It was a very strong emotional baggage, and as I was saying, the Polish government in exile never formally recognized that secession of territories. But yet there was another tradition which grew in strength in the 1950s and the 1960s in the émigré communities, especially in Paris. Many of you will be familiar with the figure of Jerzy Giedroyć, who was the father of the Literary Institute in Paris, which published a very well-known Polish émigré journal called Kultura Paryska. And before the war, Giedroyć himself had already been a writer in pre-war Poland, and he was stressing the importance of reconciliation with those minorities who were living in pre-war Poland, especially with Ukrainians. Understanding that the only way you could engineer or engender loyalty to the Polish state by the Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities in pre-war Poland was through a policy of tolerance and recognition of their cultural sensibilities. And he continued this theme after the war together with Juliusz Mieroszewski. And together they developed what is now commonly known as the Giedroyć Doctrine, which said that in the future free Poland, after the fall of communism, it is in the Polish national interest to recognize the loss of those territories as a historical fact and to build Poland's geopolitical position in Europe on the theme of supporting Ukrainian and Belarusian claims for independence against the Soviet Union. In other words, to turn Poland into an ally of Ukrainian nationalist feeling or national consciousness as a way of fatally undermining the power of Soviet Russia and leading to the disassembling of the Soviet Union as the only way of truly guaranteeing Polish national security. And this, in fact, was this view of Jerzy Giedroyć became the spiritus movens of Polish foreign policy once Poland became independent in 1989 and 1990. And it's very symbolic that when the Ukraine formally declared independence in the late autumn of 1991, Poland on the 2nd of December 1991 was the first country in the world to acknowledge and recognize an independent Ukraine, followed rapidly by a recognition of an independent Belarus at the end of December 1991. And this reconciliation with the concept of an independent Ukraine, a Vilnius that now belongs to Lithuania, and even independent Belarus, have allowed Poland after 1990 to become the champion of the aspirations of former communist nations such as Ukraine, and the support of Poland for the Orange Revolution and going forward, I think, has been very important. But just to go back to Poland internally, one of my long time ago interests was studying the anti-communist opposition movements in Poland throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And the shadow of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact it was very interesting to observe the publications of the samizdat publishers in the 1970s and 1980s. The initial flourishing of the Polish anti-communist opposition was very heavily linked to the historical memory of the 17th of September 1939. And in 1979, 40 years, there was a series of demonstrations and public expressions of historical memory, which were the first inklings of what was to come a year later in terms of the Solidarity Revolution. The memory of the Katyn massacre as well was something which was very much a flame that was nourished by the anti-communist opposition throughout the 1970s. And a number of, just as an anecdote, one samizdat journal in the 1980s was called ABC, Adriatic, Baltic, Morze Czarne, Adriatic, Baltic and the Black Sea, which was dedicated to furthering the memory of the legacy of Jerzy Giedroyć's vision of support for Ukrainian and Belarusian independence. The editor and publisher of that, at that time, was a very unknown dissident called Bronisław Komorowski, who then became the Polish president, and as the Polish president, became a real champion of Ukrainian interests. So, just drawing to a conclusion now. So, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, its shadow continued to drive historical events after the Second World War, not just within the Second World War. But after 1990, that shadow, I would say, almost transformed itself into a ghost. And that ghost of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact continued to exist and affect history. And I think after 1990, this became visible in several ways. I mean, first of all, I think, again, this reference has been made to the need to, the battle for historical memory, I think, is something that continues to be a necessity in the shadow of the pact. I think it's been pointed out that the knowledge of the 1939 campaign against Poland is relatively little known in the West. It's good to see Roger Morehouse, who's a very well-known historian, has just published a book in England called First to Fight, which is a grand attempt to recover that knowledge of the 1939 September campaign. There are other historical memories which still need to be made more public in the West. And I think one of those historical memories is this struggle for national identity during the war in the former Eastern Territories. Some historians, such as Timothy Snyder and Anne Applebaum, have already made a heroic start. But I think more needs to be done to bring to the public memory that history. But above all, as has already been said, the historical memory of what the essence of the Nazi-Soviet Pact was is absolutely crucial in order to prevent the idea that there was no equivalence between Nazism and Soviet communism. A myth which has given succor to the left, to the European left, to the West European left for decades after the war, and indeed continues to emerge among some sections of the British and European left in their analyses of history. It's a myth which, as we well know, continues to drive Russian state attitudes today. We would not have the revival of this underlying philosophy of that it is justifiable for a state to incur when a neighboring state becomes a failed state, or that the concept of statehood can only be related to singularly ethnic territories. The concepts of historical ownership of territories as justifying the rupture of borders. These were all themes which came out in Russian propaganda, starting from Georgia in the action against the Donbass, against Ukrainian Crimea, and is a rhetoric that we hear in relation to the Baltics today. So what is obviously saddening is how strongly those arguments resonate amongst some in the West. But I would postulate that one of the reasons is that not enough has been done to expose the crime of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Final comment is just that as I think we battle to revive the meaning of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in the West, so the embers and the memories of that pact still linger and burn bright in Poland. And it's one of the reasons why Poles, especially today, are highly sensitive to what they see as a revival of what was the spirit of the pact. In other words, that two grand powers on the east and on the western frontiers of Poland can agree the fate of a country without its participation. And if we try to understand why is it that Poland has been so active in protesting against the Nord Stream gas pipeline, this refers very much to that historical memory, that the Nord Stream pipeline especially is seen by Poland as being an example of how national interests, whether they be of Poland or of Ukraine, can be subordinated to the temporary interests of Germany and Russia working together. And also the fears of the experience of the failure of the Western allies to come to Poland's assistance in 1939, to a large part, drive Poland today to be looking to its own defense and security relationships, primarily with the United States, and on the basis of a strong relationship with the United States that brings US military personnel installations into Poland. Because without those military installations, without that US personnel, the concept of a tripwire may not really be very reliable. Many of you will be familiar with the decision by President Obama in 2009 to announce to the Poles that he was no longer proceeding with his missile defense facility, the Bush missile defense facility in Poland. That announcement was made by President Obama on the 17th of September 2009, precisely the anniversary, the 70th anniversary of the invasion of Poland by the Soviet Union. And this sense that never again must Poland allow itself to be without military forces in Poland, I think that was an important lesson of that announcement. And as a number of us are on Twitter, and we see today the Russian Foreign Ministry defending the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, I think there is no greater illustration of what Russia is today, given that it supports and justifies and legitimizes an agreement which has brought so much tragedy to Poland and Europe, not just in 1939 or 1941, but in the entire post-war period. And that speaks volumes for the Russia as it is today. Thank you very much.
I now want to, excuse me, I'd now like to introduce George Laughlin. George has had two, probably more than two lives, but the two lives which are relevant here are, first of all, that until the recent European elections, he had been a member of the European Parliament for Fidesz for about 14 years, having returned to Hungary after 1989. Between 1950 and 1989, he had a very successful academic career in the United Kingdom, lecturing at the University of London, at CIAS, and I've forgotten, pronounce? Cease. In the area of nationalism and Central and Eastern Europe. And of course, he also served in such places as the BBC in the time he was in London. He was a leading figure, I remember, as someone who was always looking for experts on what was happening in the communist world in the 60s and 70s to lecture. He was a leading figure who told us what was happening here during the years in which we couldn't easily come to see for ourselves. George, it's a great pleasure to ask you to be the fourth speaker.
Well, thank you very much, John, and my thanks to the Danube Institute this opportunity. What I want to do today is to look at the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in a 20th century context from a Hungarian perspective. And I've asked for this map to be shown. It'll become clear from my presentation why Molotov-Ribbentrop is in a way relevant to this. So what I want to do is to start in 1914. What happens? Outbreak of the First World War, little known, that actually Hungary, in the form of the Prime Minister Tisza, was very uneasy about it. He was against Hungarian participation in Austria-Hungary. In the end, he was won over. But I think he understood that getting Hungary into that war as part of Austria-Hungary would have deeply negative consequences for Hungary. This, of course, ensued. 1918, those of you who read Hungarian will possibly be familiar with Otto Spál's book, Elátkozott Köztársaság, The Cursed Republic. I hope it comes out in English. It's an excellent book about what happens in 1918-19. It's chaos, followed by the 133-day Soviet Republic, followed by the Romanian occupation, followed by the Red Terror, the White Terror. And then 1920, Treaty of Trianon. Now, if you put it out of the way, if you look at the map, it's that central part which is left. In fact, the entire territory of pre-1914 Hungary is not there. Hungary at that point has a population of 20 million. It's reduced to a population of 7 million. I don't know that many other countries underwent such a radical loss of territory, which goes with all sorts of other things like the sense of loss, defeat, humiliation, and so on. What I want to add here is that it also made Hungary, customarily referred to as Rump Hungary, an ethnically homogeneous state. It was 95% ethnically Hungarian. The remainder were mostly German, some Slovak, some South Slavs. Just to run ahead, today, Hungary is one of the countries which is condemned for not being diverse enough. So the West imposes ethnic homogeneity, 2 generations, so they say, why are you ethnically homogeneous? Well, hey-ho, you know, that's part of my theme. If you're in a weak position, you are in a weak position. So, secondly, in this context, cultural trauma. There's quite a lot of interesting writing. What happens when a particular collectivity, community, goes through a trauma, how it deals with the trauma, the loss of territory, the approximately 3 million people who were indubitably ethnically Hungarian, who were transferred, made citizens or probably better subjects of another state, non-consensually, they were never asked. Some of my family ended up in Czechoslovakia, not in Transylvania, unusually in that respect. And the culture of defeat. There's a very interesting book by Wolfgang Schivelbusch on the culture of defeat, how the American South, France after 1871, and Germany after the First World War cope with defeat. I'd love to see a historian, and I'm not one, do something for Hungary. How do you compensate? Well, I think the most important fact was that the entire spectrum of Hungarian opinion in the interwar period was committed to revisionism, to getting the territories back. How much territory? It's an open question. Well, The problem was that the security system of Central Europe was set up by France with the specific objective of keeping Germany, Austria, and Hungary down. The countries surrounding Hungary, not Austria, were part of the Little Entente, which had an anti-Hungarian objective. They weren't very well disposed towards Hungary at all. They were not very well disposed towards the Hungarian populations. C.A. McCartney, whose name will be familiar to you, has this monograph published, I think, in 37 or 38, called Hungary and Her Successors. It's still very readable. It may even be available on the internet. I'm not absolutely sure of this. If you look at the entire interwar period, Hungary is very isolated. It's a weak country. Industrially, economically, we have roughly 3 million people who are in some kind of peasant status. There's an absence of capital, better and stabilizes the system, but they can't actually growth going very successfully. So from the security perspective, what Hungary has to do is to recognize that it is no longer a major power, as it was before 1914, but a very minor power. So what do? We look for patrons. Well, the first patron we find is Italy. 1926, I think, is the agreement. This later on becomes Germany. Germany, despite the French security system, of course, re-emerges, especially after the crash with Hitler. I'm not sure that Hungary had many other alternatives but to accept that Germany was the dominant, possibly the hegemonic power in Central Europe. And a part of the Hungarian elite was rather Anglophile. Remember, before 1914, much of the Hungarian was very Francophile, of course, with Trianon, that went up, disappeared. France was regarded as the arch enemy, and the various Hungarian figures who were very pro-French couldn't really work this out. Hungarians will know who I mean by Mihai Bobic, who was one of them. 38. Well, you'll see that on the map, it doesn't say Austria, it says Germany. With Anschluss, Germany becomes an immediate neighbor of Hungary. Most disagreeable. This is not something that, of course, Hungary could do anything about. Then we've heard about Czechoslovakia, Munich, and so on. What I want to come in here is that Hungary at that point said, okay, fine, well, there are territories that are ethnically Hungarian in Czechoslovakia that we really rather like to have back. So to cut the long story short, they sit down, they negotiate to some extent with Prague, but above all with the Slovaks. They are unable to come to an agreement. Basically, Hungary wants a lot of territory. The Slovaks say, oh, we might give you a few square kilometers. I exaggerate, but only slightly. Eventually, the whole thing goes to Vienna. There's a meeting in the Belvedere. Hitler, but more importantly, the Italian Foreign Minister Ciano, they basically forced the Slovaks into this agreement. And that strip along the border, the Hungary's northern border, which is, I don't know what color you'd call that, some kind of lilac, that's reattached to Hungary. It's 90% Hungarian speaking. There are small Slovak communities to the south of Košice, but basically, in terms of ethnicity, this is overwhelmingly Hungarian territory. It's another story whether the Hungarians of Czechoslovakia were entirely delighted with being reattached to the mother country, but I'll leave that to one side. Well, the point I want to add here is that Germany was unenthusiastic about this, but went along with it. And of course, it left Hungary indebted to Germany and obviously to some extent Italy. Then, 1939, Czechoslovakia disappears. So Hungary at that point occupies Transcarpathia. This is the one-day republic. Norman Davis's book, Vanished Kingdoms, has a chapter on it. The Ruthenians declare their independence, and Hungary says, well, actually, you're a bit of a security risk. We're certainly not going to allow a tiny statelet up there. So we occupy the northern part of Transcarpathia, which isn't Hungarian. I mean, there's a small Hungarian population, but it's overwhelmingly, I don't know, Ruthene, Ukrainian, Tutsi, people from hereabouts. Their ethnic identity is somewhat fluid. And then you'll see this small strip. It's, on this map, it says ceded by Slovakia in April 1939. Well, that's a bit of a euphemism. The Hungarian army occupied it. They wanted a defensive frontier on the river Ung. Slovaks didn't really like this at all. In fact, they were decidedly unhappy about it. So that's the context in which Molotov-Ribbentrop happens. And Hungary is very, very quiet about Molotov-Ribbentrop. They really don't want to get involved in this. And the one thing which, to the credit of the Hungarian government, is that they say to the Germans, no attacks on Poland through Hungarian territory. If you look at it, you know, there is the railway lines which would take you up to the Polish border. There's a common Polish-Hungarian border now. The Hungarians say no to that. So Hungary is neutral at that particular point. And indeed, I don't have an exact figure, but a substantial number of Polish soldiers fleeing from Germans or Russians, Soviets, Red Army, make their way through Hungary. Quite a lot go through Romania. They come to Hungary, and eventually they manage to get out through Italy. One of them was the sociologist Stanislav Andreski, whose name you may know. He told me that he was put up in the Citadella in here above the Danube in Budapest. He, by the way, coined the term kleptocracy. Little known factoid. He's a very, very interesting sociologist, actually. And of course, once the Soviet Union attacks, well, the Soviet Union too is a neighbor. This really is a very uneasy situation. Barbarossa changes this. Hungary joins the war after the bombing of Košice. It's still a controversy as to who bombed Košice. Various hypotheses are advanced. One was that it was Hungary itself, which is, I think, nonsense. It was both the airport and the town were bombed. Then possible the Slovaks did it, or the Germans did it to provide a pretext for Hungary joining the war. My theory, for which, by the way, there's practically no evidence, but it's a good theory nevertheless, is that the Soviet Union bombed it by mistake. They wanted to bomb Prešov, Eperjes, which is not on the map, but sort of 40, 50 kilometers to the north. And from there, they look quite similar. It's as good a hypothesis as any. It's perfectly possible, by the way, that, you know, the Soviet pilots simply got it wrong. Anyway, at that point, Hungary declares war. We send the Second Hungarian Army to Russia. It's utterly destroyed in January 43. And from that point, militarily, Hungary becomes effectively a non-belligerent. And indeed, then the Hungarian government is basically adopting a semi-neutral position. Allied airmen who parachute into Hungary are sort of allowed quietly to leave, etc., etc. And then there are the negotiations in Istanbul, in Stockholm, I think mostly, there may be some in Lisbon as well, to see if we could find some kind of a way out, to which the answer is invariably unconditional surrender. So they keep hoping that the Allied advance would take place through the Balkans. But Churchill loses on this one, and unconditional surrender, when it happens, of course, is to the Red Army, to the Russians. But before that, March 1944, Hungary is occupied by the Germans, Operation Margareta, because I think they understand that Hungary is moving towards non-belligerency, complete non-belligerency. So Hungary is occupied, that's my own personal memory. You know, all hell breaks loose, the Red Army invades Hungary, siege of Budapest, armistice. Hungary is liberated on the 4th of April 45. Where we are sitting now is a heap of smoking ruins. Again, that's my own personal memory. Then we have the renewed trauma. The trauma of being occupied again, the destruction, shall we say, the rapacity of the Red Army. Then, to cut the story short, the communist takeover, the restoration of Trianon frontiers. Everything is frozen in terms of international security. There's a Soviet security system of which Hungary is a member. 1956, I won't go into any detail on this, doesn't really change anything. Communism freezes the system. Hungary has very little agency, but of course, there is a massive socio-economic transformation of Hungary. The historic peasantry is effectively destroyed. Then I'll fast forward to 1989. Basically, post-89, the governments accept the new frontiers. The Trianon frontiers are, in that sense, sacrosanct, but there is renewed interest in the trans-frontier Hungarians, approximately 2 to 2.5 million. The numbers are going down a bit, and this creates a very difficult situation with all our neighbors, except Austria and maybe Slovenia. In the interim, of course, we get several new neighbors. We get the Yugoslav successor states. And that is the state of play, that Hungary takes an active interest in the trans-frontier Hungarians, whose socio-cultural, economic development, of course, diverges from that of Hungary. And to some degree, when they come to Hungary, they're foreigners. They're Hungarian foreigners, but still they do things differently, especially in Transylvania. So, to wrap up, the current security system, of course, is NATO, the European Union, and I would add the Visegrad Four in this context. The cooperation among the Visegrad countries, so that's Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, is good. Occasionally we have some tension with Slovakia over the Hungarian minority, but at the moment it's not bad at all. And this gives Hungary, in a way, more weight in Brussels than it would otherwise have. And in a way, if you look at it in any kind of perspective, the idea that these four countries are capable of long-term cooperation is historically unprecedented. Okay, we can go back to the Jagellos, but I don't think we need to do that. So this, I think, is an interesting political security system innovation. It also means, by the way, that Hungary has to remain in the European Union, so don't believe anybody says that there's a Huxley being prepared. It isn't. Hungary will stay. There may be disadvantages. We disagree with Brussels on some things, but the advantages of membership greatly outweigh these. So, looking back, Hungary's 20th century history is really one of weakness from which we are gradually emerging. Think about it. I don't think there's any other European country which has undergone 4 foreign occupations. Not a bad record. I'm thinking the Romanian occupation is the first one. And I personally lived through 2 of these. One of the Hungarian answers to this is to construct power through legality. Try to do everything in legal form. Doesn't always work. Clearly, Molotov-Ribbentrop was a breach of every international legal provision you've ever heard of. And if you look at it from this perspective, of a series of defeats, of cultural traumas, foreign occupations, I think what we're doing at the moment, Hungary, the government, is working against the grain of history. It's really a very interesting perspective to say, no, we're not losers. We're going to win whatever it is success means, whatever the success criteria are in the 21st century. So thank you for your attention.
George, thank you very much indeed. Now, I want to throw open a question to the entire panel, which will also give them the opportunity, if they wish, to disagree with each other before I turn it to you. The title of this program is The Twin Totalitarianisms. And certainly the concept of totalitarianism seems, to me at least, to emerge strongly as a result of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. In fact, David, in your book, From Plato to NATO, you distinguish between periods in which Western policies, it goes through an anti-fascist period, which is from the Popular Front to the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and then an anti-totalitarian period in which the West sees both Nazism and communism as, so to speak, identical twins. until, of course, 41, and then we go back to anti-fascism, until 47, 48, when we go back to anti-totalitarianism. And that continues really until the Vietnam War, when you get a period of anti-fascism, although it's now called anti-imperialism as a result of the Vietnam War being the kind of casus non belli here. So I'm interested if you think, if all of you think, the concept of totalitarianism has real, was it ever accurate and true? Is it today? And does it have any real political force in the post-1989 world? Maybe we'll start with you, Andrew, and just go down the line.
Thank you. Yes, I certainly do see Russia and Germany at that time as the Tweedledee and Tweedledum of totalitarianism. I think that they were tremendously alike. When it comes to your to whether or not the concept is useful today, I think it certainly is. The idea that totalitarianism is actually, if anything, on the march, especially in China. And the way in which you see what they're doing with social credit in China and so on, and their control and what they've done to Google and the rest, it strikes me that the fact that the Nazis are no longer with us, but totalitarianism is still with us, is something that's a very important aspect of modern day global politics.
Yeah, yes, I would agree with much of that, and especially in regard to China, because, yes, you mentioned the social credit system. I think I would add to that, however, that we're seeing also in the Western countries this sneaking control, censorship via the social media companies who claim to be independent, claim independence because they're not they're not controllable by the governments, and so they're training whole generations to think identical thoughts, which is not entirely working, thank God, but it is totalitarian in principle. And totalitarianism has traditionally had some elements that we don't really see, like the strong leader. Okay, in China you have Xi Jinping, but social media, is Zuckerberg a strong leader? I'm not sure, but the idea of thought control is becoming more and more a part of what we see here. Back in the day of communism and Nazism, I mean, Stalinism and Maoism were much better at thought control than Hitler ever was, because they really wanted to own your body and soul, and they succeeded to an amazing extent. And now that same control is coming in the guise of things that are supposed to be emancipatory, like social media and networking. But it's this insidious thought control that is really the aspect of totalitarianism that I think has survived best, and unfortunately seems to have the future ahead of it.
Well, very, very interesting point, actually. I think one of the more interesting aspects of looking at how Western analysts have tried to define totalitarianism is to see how that has shifted over time, and actually with a very important contribution that Central European dissidents made to the definition of totalitarianism. Back in the old Cold War days, it was actually Zbigniew Brzezinski and Karl Friedrich who came up with the concept of the definition of totalitarianism, which fitted very well the more extreme forms of Soviet communism and Nazi totalitarianism, which was this concept of a single ideology, a single leader, a single party, huge repression, autarkic economy, and there were probably one or two others, which fitted very well what was actually the realities of the Soviet Union in the 40s and the 50s. When, after Khrushchev, the Soviet Union began to soften, and especially after Central Europe began to diverge from the Soviet model, especially in countries like Hungary and Yugoslavia, and to some extent in Poland in the 1970s, the fact that these countries no longer fitted that definition of totalitarianism lowered the guard of many Western analysts and strategists who came to the conclusion, well, actually, it's all softening, we're all heading in a nice direction. There was even this theory that at some point we would all converge, that there would be a soggy middle, that the reform communism and increasingly statitized Western economies would meet. And this was part of the reason why you had in some areas a tendency of Western policy to soften towards Soviet Russia and the concept of detente and so on, and the idea that you could come to a modus vivendi with post-totalitarian leaders. This was fundamentally challenged from within Central Europe. And it came from people and dissidents, such as especially Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, who said, actually, that's not the essence of totalitarianism. The essence of totalitarianism is not that you have a sort of a superficial state control, but you have an infection of the soul. You have a skewing of personality. You have and the normalization of the lie as a way of social survival. And the challenge of communism is actually to revive the human spirit. And that is the way to actually achieve real change, real democracy, and real liberty. And so Western responses to totalitarianism, I think, were driven increasingly by that realization that what Western policy had to be about was not coming to a modus vivendi at the elite level between Western leaders and post-Soviet and Soviet leaders or Eastern European leaders, but to increasingly engage with societies in Central Europe. And that was actually started by, well, no one else but Lady Thatcher, who, when she was Prime Minister, understood that the support for the Solidarity resistance in Poland and the support for the Polish Catholic Church, it was something that Ronald Reagan understood, that you had to have a moral alliance with the Vatican under John Paul II, etc., etc. So, so how we define totalitarianism is very interesting, and how that's shifted over time to recognize it's more subtle than just jackboots marching down the high street. I think it was a very important transition.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to disagree with you, because my own perspective on totalitarianism is that it has something of a historical context, and that historical context is over. In other words, the necessary condition for creating or bringing about something which we can properly call totalitarianism has gone, namely a pre-modern society that can be mobilized into something which you can call a kind of modernity. It obviously applies to Soviet Russia, it applies to Italy, to some extent it applies to Germany, although Germany was at I don't really believe in progress, but let's say a more advanced, higher level of industrialization. So what I see totalitarianism is an attempt at total control. There's no legitimate pluralism. Even two individuals meeting might be, in certain circumstances, suspect. And the transformation. Now, which has to be controlled against an overarching ideology. Now, these, I think, are absent. Not completely absent, but in this particular form that I've sketched, I think they're absent. There are obviously parallels that control, but that I think is true of all societies, whether it's control of discourse, control of vocabulary. All societies do this in some form or another, making certain things unsayable. Let me give you an example from my own personal experience. This would be about 1990. Well, during the 70s and 80s, the Hungarian authorities would frequently not allow me in, but occasionally they did allow me in. I got rather used to having my visa request turned down, but by 1989 this was over. And I remember talking to somebody who was about purchasing of property, which was a big thing in Hungary around that time. And I said, well, the way it's done in Britain is that you apply for a mortgage. Jelzálogkölcsön. This person looked at me and clearly had no idea what I was talking about, because the concept was absent. The word was there in Hungarian and it had no content. Well, it's acquired content since, of course. So what I'm getting at is that there are certain ideas, concepts, words, which in technical language are empty signifiers. They have no meaning. So even if you know it, you don't associate anything with them. And all systems of power do this. All systems of power try to eliminate ambiguity. It's just that a totalitarian system tries to do this as far as it possibly can. Now, I don't know if any of you were old enough to live through the 1950s in Hungary, but if you were, then you will know that there were gaps in the system. There was a climate of terror, of course. Beret, in his book, writes that something like between in the one period of 3 years, I think, 52 to 55, the authorities interrogated over 1 million people and interned 45% of them. Imagine a population of a little under 10 million. And this is 10% of society. This is enormous. So you have a mechanism of terror. That, of course, has a legacy. And one of its legacies, which to some extent we're still grappling with, is the memory of terror and then the agency, the lack of trust, the atomization. In that sense, the legacies of totalitarianism remain. They're very difficult to overcome. The best way to overcome it, and I regret to have to say this as a self-respecting conservative, is have a revolution. It clears the air. That's my Estonian experience, where they did have a revolution, the singing revolution, and they managed to clear out an awful lot of what I'm going to call dead wood. This story is not very well known, but Estonia declares independence, 1991, and the new president, Lennart Meri, basically, and there was a tremendous ethno-national unity. He says, okay, we're going to create a new system here, everybody over 40 out of politics. A very successful formula. We in Hungary had too big a carryover, and I think the same is true of Poland as well. It's to do with a soft transition. So that's why I'm so reluctant as a decent conservative to say, sometimes revolutions are good for you.
Well, we might have a conference on that at some time, George. I think that we might also have a longer discussion on totalitarianism, but on some other occasion, because I'm going to throw open questions to the floor now. Yes, Mark Higgy.
Well, thank you. Mark Higgy, Danube Institute. Thank you very much for 4 terrific presentations on an infamous historical event that doesn't get the attention it deserves. On the contortions of communist parties around the world, my favourite story is of Tito, head of the Yugoslav communists, who, when his country was invaded in April 1941, well, his country was invaded in April 1941, and Tito's first call for resistance was on June the 22nd, 1941, which I think says it all. The one disappointment of today is that, as far as I'm aware, we don't have a representative from the Russian embassy. I would love to hear a response and a defence of the current Moscow line. But look, I just had one small question of historical detail which I found fascinating, and that was from Marek Matrashek. And that was, I think you mentioned that when the details of the Katyn massacre were uncovered, the Polish government in exile ceased relations with the Soviet government. I mean, it seems extraordinary that those relations continued after the events of September 1939. Did I understand that correctly? And did in fact the Polish-Soviet relations continue for some time afterwards? And what's the explanation for the fact that they did?
They started again on the 22nd of June 1941, and then when the massacre was revealed in 1943, they got...
They ceased between September 39 and 41, right, okay.
It was actually Stalin who severed. So, yeah, I mean, as Andrew says, immediately after the... just to go back to 1939, it was still it's just a matter of historical interest that for a long time the Polish government in exile assumed that a state of war existed between Poland and the Soviet Union. This was mentioned by the Polish President Mościcki in exile in London several times. So not only was Poland invaded by the Soviet, but the Polish government in exile assumed there was a state of war. As Andrew says, after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, very quickly in July 1941, Stalin and Sikorsky met and re-established diplomatic relations, as a result of which the Anders Army was allowed to be created on the territory of the Soviet Union, which was then evacuated through Iraq in late 1941, early 1942. And then upon the discovery of the Katyn graves by the Germans in April 1943, the fact that the Polish government of exile acknowledged that these were crimes committed by the Germans, by the Nazis, by the Soviets as opposed to the Germans. At that point, Stalin accused the Polish government in exile of being a collaborationist power with Nazi Germany and severed diplomatic relations. And that, going forward, then allowed Stalin through 1944 and 1945 to establish his own puppet government in Poland. And then history took its course, because that was that government controlled by communists that acknowledged the loss of the eastern territories of Poland to the Soviet Union, and then managed the process of the totalitarianization of Poland after 1945.
Sorry, can I just add that actually I knew Count Edward Radziński, the last president of Poland in exile. He was 100 years old, dressed absolutely superbly in three-piece suits cut at Savile Row, was a giant. And the point he made, which I think is a very, very strong one, is that it would have been understandable up until 1945 for the Foreign Office not to have accepted that the Soviets were responsible for the Katyn massacre, maybe 1946, but to carry on until 1972 shows an absolutely shameful position on behalf of our diplomats. When one thinks of what Marek was talking about at Monte Cassino and at Arnhem, and the RAF pilots, Polish pilots in the RAF, and what they did for the Royal Navy as well, what we owed Poland and the way we repaid Poland was really despicable.
Actually, Putin... I'm sorry. Yes.
Again, just a brief personal story. I worked for the BBC in the 60s and 70s, external services, and we were simply not allowed to talk about Katyn. Government policy was just don't talk about it. We didn't actually have to say it was the Germans that did it, but we weren't allowed to talk about it. Oh, and Andrew, there were also Poles in Normandy.
Actually, just on that last point that Andrew made, I mean, it's a sad thought that Putin has actually shown greater recognition towards the British merchant marine who delivered arms and equipment to Soviet Russia through the Murmansk and Archangel ports by giving a medal to them than the British did at the end of 1945 to the Poles, whom they didn't allow to march in the victory parade. So that, I think, was shameful. Before I ask, yes, but for one moment, by the way, is there somebody here from the Russian embassy? Because if there is, we'd be delighted to take a question. No? Okay. Yes, ladies.
Thank you. Okay, I'm not a historian. I'm just, how to say that, a subject of the ex-Soviet rule of Hungary. I would say that we were in a worse position than Poland or the other Soviet-occupied countries, because we were taken away 2/3 of our territory. And in fact, what is true about Soviet communism and why we cannot compare the two totalitarian regimes, because the German or the Nazi regime lasted only for 12 years, but the Soviet occupation lasted from 1917 until 1989. And in fact, in Hungary from 1948 until 1989. And what I can tell about the Soviet communism, I didn't live in the Nazi occupation that the notions and the verbs were reversed. So my generation was brought up in a culture of lies. And people were taken away, eliminated from their personal freedom. And after 1989, we didn't know much about real estates, about taxes, about anything that the free world lived. So we can say that there were about 2 million losers in Hungary after the so-called freedom, because we were like pigeons that were set free from a cage, but didn't know how to fly. So this is what I would like to say, that if I compare the two things, communism is longer, and it's 110 million victims, while the Nazis has not so much, 10 million about. And it is still raging around the world, communism. And it gives beautiful ideas to you, and you begin to like them. But when they become true, it is the living hell. Because it takes away everything from the person, from the man, what makes you a man. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I think really that's really a question, but would anyone like to comment on it? No, I think probably you have a lot of agreement on the platform. This will have to be the final question, I think, and then we will be meeting in the next room for a reception. So the gentleman here, two questions here. The gentleman there and the gentleman just in the third row.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm the ambassador of Norway. There are a couple of quite interesting connections here, 1939, 1940, 41, etc. I actually also have a question. What happened in our case was, of course, that the communists were Norwegian communists, totally paralyzed by the agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union. And this changed on the 22nd of June, as in many other cases, 1941. We were occupied by Germany from April the 9th, 1940, and the Germans actually had the Soviet Union sever diplomatic relations with our government in exile, just a couple of weeks before June 1941. But it showed at least the enormous pressure put on the Soviet government and the willingness of the Soviet government to appease Hitler. So this is part of the pattern. I just wonder, from the point of view of process, when you negotiate a non-aggression treaty like this, who makes the first step? Where did the idea originate? I think our understanding is that this was an idea which was conceived primarily in Germany. I think we all agree that it suited both parties, but somebody needed to make the idea or float the idea. Was it Ambassador Franz von Papen in Ankara, or was it somebody in the Auswärtiges Amt in Berlin, or where did the idea come from, which was then the original basis?
I had read somewhere that Churchill made a secret agreement with the Soviets prior to the end of World War II that the Soviets would be allowed to take over Poland. That would be their sphere of influence. At the same time, telling the Polish government in England that they're going to be able to go back into the country. Is that true or not?
No, it's not true. What you had was the Yalta Agreement, of course, of February 1945, in which Churchill believed that Stalin was telling the truth when he said that he was going to respect the integrity and independence of Poland. And you also had over 1 million Red Army troops in Poland at the time, meaning that even if he didn't believe Stalin, there was next to nothing that he could do about it. You also, of course, in the October of 1944, when Stalin and Churchill met in Moscow, have what was nicknamed the Notorious Document, in which certain percentages for different countries were written down. This verged on the absurd, certainly with Hungary, in which it was going to be broken down 50-50, a recipe for civil war if ever there was one. And you had some countries like Greece that was going to be 90% pro-Western and 10% pro-Soviet, maybe even 100 to 0. And that at least actually held. But for the rest of it, it was pie in the sky, frankly.
Could I just add something to this? Yes, it's correct. Hungary was 50-50 on the first day, but the next day, Eden and Molotov changed this to 80-20 in favor of the Soviet Union. So even that was more fluid than it appears. But I want to say something about this, Your Excellency. Don't forget that Germany and Russia, Soviet Union, have relations going back to much earlier, to 22 or 23. I'm thinking of Rapallo. The Rapallo Agreement, if you like, the two excluded states of the 1920s international situation. They sign a trade agreement, cooperation agreement. There is trade between the two countries, including raw materials, of course. I suspect that some of the Soviet industrialization is based on German models, I'm guessing. And secondly, by the 1930s, the Wehrmacht was training in the Soviet Union. Guderian, the Panzer leader, he did an awful lot of his training in Russia. Lots of empty space where you could work out tank tactics. And I'm not sure that the offensive in the Ardennes would have been possible if the German panzers had not had this experience of training in Russia. So it doesn't come out of the blue entirely.
It's very interesting, this period of 1945 and how Churchill came to recognize there really was no alternative to allowing Stalin to impose his agenda on Poland and Central Europe. The Cesura came with the dispute about who are the legitimate authorities in Poland, and apart from the betrayal of 1939, apart from the severance of diplomatic relations between Stalin and the Polish government in exile in 1943, the final denouement came when the British government and the Allies decided to cease recognizing the Polish government in exile in London as the legitimate government in Poland, which was resisting various aspects of the Yalta Agreement, saying don't trust Stalin, and shifting the diplomatic relations to the communist-controlled Polish temporary government of national unity, as it was called, that had been set up by Stalin and the Polish communists in Lublin in the autumn of 1944, under the pretext that this government would then undertake free elections in Poland. And it caused a split in the Polish government in exile when Stanisław Mikołajczyk, who was the leader of the peasant faction, flew to Poland and joined the government as a deputy prime minister, knowing his mission was doomed to failure, and indeed it was. As you know, the elections in 1947 were falsified, and very rapidly Poland was put under the communist yoke completely. And as a final little footnote, this issue of the legitimacy of the Polish government in exile actually continued throughout the second half of the 20th century, and only came to a conclusion in 1990 when President Wałęsa became the first democratically elected president of a free Poland in November 1990. The question arose of the legitimacy of the Polish government of exile, and it was then not President Raczyński, who had unfortunately died by that point, but President, I think it was Sabat, who came to Poland and handed over the insignia of the previous Polish government in exile, which themselves had come from the royal castle in 1939, back to the royal castle, and as it were symbolically closing that circle. So to go back to your point about the legitimacy of decisions, that was the story.
Just a word to the gentleman from the Norwegian embassy. Mr. Ambassador, I think that the Soviets made the first move, and feelers were put out, I think, in 1938 as part of Stalin's new strategy. It's not clear, however, whether that really was the first move, because as Joshua said, I mean, there were things going on back in the early 20s, but my recollection is that for the pact, the immediate prehistory of the pact, the feelers come from Moscow, and they come about a year and a half before the pact is signed.
Thank you. Before I hand over to Andrew Roberts for the last word, I just think it worth mentioning that there's a documentary film called The Soviet Story, in which there is about a 20-minute passage on the period from the Nazi-Soviet Pact to 22nd of June 41, which contains absolutely astonishing footage and still photography of, for example, KGB generals at the meeting of Molotov has in Berlin, leaning forward eagerly, hanging on to every word that Goebbels is saying at the same table. But in particular, there's a long passage in which the posters, the language, and the general aesthetics of the two totalitarianisms are compared one after the other. And the comparison, the identity actually, is astounding, demonstrating, I think, a real ideological, not coordination, but real ideological sympathy between them, which is very hard to grasp as completely as this documentary, which has not been given a great deal of attention, shows. It's worth seeing, The Soviet Story. But now, Andrew.
Just before I end with a joke about Joachim von Ribbentrop, I would like to, that's pretty unusual concept. I would like to just say what an incredibly high quality discussion we've had today. It was really something to come to Budapest and hear somebody discuss the counterfactual differences between A.J.P. Taylor, Hugh Trevor Roper, and E.H. Carr. It's absolutely, it's a dream afternoon as far as I'm concerned. So thank you very much indeed to the Institute. Okay, so the Ribbentrop joke. When he was not foreign minister, but German ambassador to London in the 1930s, he met Winston Churchill at a reception and attempted to threaten him. And he said, came up to him and said, "In the next war, Italy will be on the side of the Third Reich." And Churchill replied, "Well, it seems only fair. We had to have them last time." Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.